is James Campbell. I'm the senior minister here at First Congregational Church, and it is my pleasure on behalf of the people of the congregation to welcome you to the Meeting House. Not so many people call this room the Meeting House anymore, but to do so reminds us that in the history of Cheshire, this was not just God's house, but also the people's house. It was here that the common good was held and is held in highest esteem. It is in this room for many years that town hall meetings were held. Just underneath this room you are in is where the town hall itself used to be housed. In more recent times, this meeting house has been used for concerts and recitals, interfaith gatherings, Jewish high holy days, prom pictures, Cheshire Academy convocations, and historical tours. How appropriate, then, that the meeting house is once again being used for the common good. As we turn our attention this evening to the common good, not just of Cheshire, but of the planet and of all living things. So once again, welcome one and all to the Meeting House. And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Ann Mcnulty, who is chair of this congregation's Environmental Justice team.
As you just heard, I'm Ann Mcnulty, co-chair of the Environmental Justice team here at First Congregational Church of Cheshire, which, along with our partners in the Cheshire Creation Care, St. Peter's Episcopal Church and Temple Beth David, are delighted to sponsor this talk. Dan Esg, a member of our Environmental Justice team, will speak on the topic, The World Steps Up, a report from the Climate Change Frontlines at Glasgow. He recently attended the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, returning just last week. Dan is the director of the Yale Center of Environmental Law and Policy and co-director of the Yale Initiative on Sustainable Finance. He is a Hillhouse professor at Yale in the Schools of Law and the Environment. He has held various leadership roles in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and is a past commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. He received his undergraduate degree from Harvard, a law degree from Yale, and studied as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. He has edited or authored 10 books, including Green to Gold and A Better Planet, as well as numerous papers on environmental protection, regulatory reform, and sustainability. Dan will present his prepared remarks, and then we will open it up for questions. We request that you come to the front and use the microphone to pose your questions, or signal, and we have the portable microphone. This event is being recorded and live streamed, and we want everyone to be able to hear what you are asking. So, I will hereby turn over the microphone to Dan Esg.
Let's see, it sounds like we're live and going. Ian, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming to what I hope will be a conversation. In fact, we are going to have people speak to the microphones, or we can bring a microphone to you if you want. So interrupt me if there's something truly pressing, because I do want this to be a give and take and to really get into the issues. But it is a very special moment to be here. And I want to report back to you that I think the world hit a watershed moment in Glasgow in the last 2 weeks. And I want to explain why. But before I do that, I want to take a step back and tell you a little bit about my now more than 30 years working on this issue. And I want to take you back to the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change. And as that was coming together, and we were preparing to bring it to the world community and put it in front of leaders at the Rio Earth Summit in June of 1992. I remember being taken aside by the Secretary General of that gathering, a Canadian diplomat and businessman named Morris Strong. and we were waiting to visit with my boss, the head of the EPA, and I asked him how he thought things were going. And he said to me something I didn't quite appreciate at the time, but I've come to very much understand in the years that passed. He said to me, Dan, you have to realize, when we gather the whole world, 120 plus leaders, which at that time in 1992 was the largest gathering ever of presidents and prime ministers, and all of the other ministers that will accompany them, and thousands of media people, tens of thousands of environmental groups and other non-governmental organizations, NGOs. He said only two outcomes are possible: success and real success. Now, I have to sadly report to you, having been one of those that launched this process in 1992, that the intervening decades brought success, but not real success. Emissions continued to rise, the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere went on, and frankly, temperatures continued to rise, and the risk of the kind of threats that we know climate change can pose began to become more apparent. Heat waves, droughts, fires from those droughts, changed rainfall patterns, the risk of rising sea level, more intense hurricanes and windstorms. In fact, this year we ran out of letters of the alphabet in naming our hurricanes. So the risks appear real, and I think the reality of the need to respond has also become more real. And that's what I saw in Glasgow. And I want to just share with you why I, despite what does seem like a very tough moment, have some optimism that the world may have turned a corner. This may be a watershed moment. And I tell my students who I talked to this morning about this, that they may look back, because they will be the ones that lived through this century. They may look back in 2070 or 2080 and say it was then and there, Glasgow 2021, that the world got serious about the need for what we now call deep decarbonization. And I think there are several reasons to be worried about whether that unfolds. There still is a possibility that we will end up with this Glasgow meeting just being quote-unquote success, but not really transformative change coming out of it. But here's why I think there is some reason for hope. First, I think that the world came together, not fully, but largely, around an emerging consensus that we need to bring down our greenhouse gas emissions quite rapidly and quite dramatically. And I think the emerging consensus is now that we need to have net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Now, the official agreement that came out, the so-called Glasgow Climate Pact, which is online for those who want to look, says something a little different. Does anyone know what it says? It says that we're going to have net zero greenhouse gas emissions by about mid-century. Why would it say that? Because China's committed to bring its emissions down to net zero in 2060 and refused to budge over the last several years. As you know, one of the worrisome signs is that China did not have President Xi show up. And the second reason is because India had said nothing about a commitment. Prime Minister Modi very proudly stood up to say in Glasgow that India would commit to net zero greenhouse gas emissions in 2070, for which he expected great adulation and was instead booed, as he should have been. But I felt, in contrast to all of that one should actually be happy that India is joining the parade, albeit in the back. So getting them into the gate and off the sidelines was, I thought, pretty important. So I do think, despite it all, Modi is to be celebrated in a minor way, but not in the way that he thought. Now, I also want to say that I think we saw a couple of other things happening that are worth noting. First, this meeting in Glasgow occurred just a couple of months after the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, as the acronym goes, issued its sixth assessment report. And for those who follow climate science, these not every year, but every 5 or 6 year reports are very important markers of what the science community thinks the climate change situation is from a scientific point of view. And this sixth report, released in August, said that the issue of climate change was of rising concern and the need for response of greater urgency. And we had been previously targeting a 2-degree rise, 2 degrees Celsius, by the way, which is more like 4 degrees Fahrenheit, rise in global average temperatures as what we should try to avoid going beyond. The IPCC said that if we let things go that far, we would face quite dire consequences. So they've pulled the target back down to 1.5 degrees. So there was a lot of talk in Glasgow about whether 1.5 degrees was still possible. And I think the commitments made in Glasgow do suggest that 1.5 degrees is still alive. And that's the way it was put. It's not for sure, it's not even probable, but it's possible. By the way, the other thing you may know is that the 2015 Paris Agreement, which is what we're building off of, had an important transition in how it was structured from prior agreements. And the prior agreements had a fatal flaw, a terrible flaw, which again I feel bad about having been part of the team that put this together. But the original 1992 agreement, replicated in 1997 with the Kyoto Protocol, said that only the developed countries of the world were going to take action, would take on real obligations. The so-called Annex 1 list of countries, 40-something in number. And the rest of the world, because there was no commitment of funding for them to take action, would, in effect, be able to sit on the sidelines. And they largely did. And that, frankly, was a double disaster. First, because the countries that took on obligations more or less leveled their emissions, but the developing country emissions just took off, notably from China, but also from India, Brazil, and a number of other countries. And even worse, the doubling of this problem was that it became an excuse for inaction in the United States. Because people said, well, why should we take action when our trade competitors, our rising trade competitor, China and India, they're not doing anything. They don't have to bear any costs. So it really broke down what was at the time a political consensus that we should all take action. By the way, just a quick quiz question. What was the approval vote in the United States Senate on that original 1992 treaty? Now, I won't make you actually answer, but my students at Yale, I can separate the A students from the B students, because the A students know it takes 60 votes to get anything done in the Senate. So they guess it must have been 60-40 or 61-39, having, as 20-something-year-olds, never seen bipartisan consensus in America. Now, the B students, of course, think it was 51-49, but in any case, the actual vote, no vote. Voice vote. No one objected. Totally unanimous. It is unimaginable today that we could have had a Senate that would wade this through without anyone objecting. But we did. And one of the tragedies is, I think, that this has become such a partisan issue. And one of the things I hope we can see is a way toward a unified nation responding to a challenge. Because it is my firm belief you can't do anything as big as relay the energy foundation of modern society on a one-party basis. Too easy for the political pendulum to swing and the next team in power to knock out what was done by the last. And we can't afford that on climate change. We need a fast and permanent move to a clean energy economy going forward. So here's some more of what I think comes out of Glasgow that makes this possible, but as I say, not for sure. One is that there were clearly a lot of compromises in this final Glasgow climate pact. There was a real push to have the statement say that we were going to phase out of coal. Now the final word says we will phase down the use of coal. Now why is that? China and India. So we do have a challenge with these two still growing, fast-growing, developing countries that are both very heavily coal-dependent. By the way, I'm not sure the U.S. would have necessarily being too enthusiastic as we're going, because there was a separate, and this is another important part of the program there, a separate side agreement. In fact, there were a whole series of side agreements, but one of them was a commitment to phase out of coal in the developed world by 2030, in the developing world by 2040. And 40 countries did sign on to that coal agreement, the side agreement, but not the United States, not China, not India. And why did the United States not sign on? I'm hearing the two words that are correct, joking. I think the administration was unwilling to jar him at a critical moment where his vote is needed for some other things. In any case, I want to also just paint a picture for you of a couple of other elements here of what was going on. I think it was clear that in this give and take, there is still not enough money being put forward to bring the developing world fully on board. Although in Paris, the agreement was that every country would make its own commitment to climate change action, called its nationally determined contribution. And for those who follow this, you'll see the acronym NDC all the time. So every country is asked, do what you can, tell us what you can do, and then, this was in Paris, report back in 5 years on how you're doing. So one of the big things in Glasgow was the stock take. Again, I think that's a translation from another language. It doesn't work too well in English. We might say stock taking. But in any case, there was a review of how all these country pledges to take action had gone. Some countries had done very well, fulfilled their targets. Some had done not so well. The U.S. had committed, by the way, to a 26 to 28% reduction in emissions, which we almost hit, which is itself remarkable, given the last 4 years, where there was not a federal government that was taking any action. To the contrary, they were pulling back. So that reflects, by the way, the reality, true in many countries, that presidents and prime ministers do not control all the levers of change that determine the carbon footprint of a society. Mayors and governors have a big effect, and more than anything, corporate leaders have an effect. 80% of our emissions are determined by decisions in particularly large companies. So one of the things that I'm going to come to in a moment is what a significant role large companies play in Glasgow. And I think, by and large, positive. A couple other observations. In 2009, the developed world had committed to mobilize, keyword, mobilize $100 billion per year for helping the developing world address its required investments to get to a clean energy future. That target has not been hit. Depending on how you do the calculation, maybe 80 billion, more likely 70 or 60 billion dollars of capital was mobilized for action in the developing world in the last couple of years. Again, per year total. There was a lot of concern in the developing world that this target had not been hit. So the Glasgow commitment says we will double the amount of money coming from the developed world over the next several years. So if it's 60 or 70 billion per year, we're going to have to now aim for 120 to 140 billion of new flow of funds. By the way, an important point, this is not government money. In fact, the government money is a tiny piece of it. The critical flow of funds is private capital. And that is another thing to really recognize. Government monies are a small part of this. In fact, there is a global climate fund that was set up now a decade ago. It's based in South Korea. And the total commitments of governments to that fund are now something like $13 or $14 billion. But that's a multi-year commitment. So it probably on a per-year basis is dispensing under $2 billion. So really woefully short of the amount fully needed. So again, this is a critical point. The private capital is going to be essential. One of the other things that you might have seen was the fact that this climate agreement was meant to be concluded last Friday, and they failed to get it done. So they went into overtime, and they in fact had to negotiate all the way through Saturday, and finally had it built on Saturday night. And I think a lot of people were worried about that, but I was not, because I think the success, to the extent there is success in Glasgow, had already been accomplished. And it had been accomplished in two other places that I want to now talk you through. One is, it was in what are known as the side agreements. The coal agreement was one, but there was also a methane agreement. 100+ countries agreed to reduce their methane emissions by 30% by 2030. Now, why is methane important? Anyone know?
80 times.
Very potent greenhouse gas. So it has, we measure how potent a greenhouse gas is by something we call global warming potential, or its radiative forcing. And carbon dioxide, our baseline concern, as a standard of 1, methane is at least 30 times, and some calculations would now say 60 or even 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide. Now, it has an interesting picture because it only lasts in the atmosphere 10 to 20 years, as opposed to hundreds in the case of carbon dioxide. But if you're trying to really change the world in fast order by 2050, getting that methane out that is so potent is a big deal. So 100+ countries, a large number of big countries included, agreeing to a 30% reduction in just 8 years is a pretty big deal. What does that do, by the way? It puts huge pressure on natural gas, which thought it was going to be the bridge fuel to a clean energy future. And by the way, it is still a good thing anytime you can take a coal-fired power plant out and substitute a natural gas plant and cut your greenhouse gas emissions in half. So that's a big deal. But not so if the methane is leaking into the atmosphere, natural gas being methane. So unless the natural gas world tightens up on its leaks, it is not a big help in getting us to a lower emissions future. But who else is going to bear pressure now? Beef and dairy. Because you've got significant methane emissions coming from those cattle and cows. So this is a big deal for a couple of industries that have kind of been a little on the sidelines. And I've been to 10 of these COPs over the years. I've never seen discussion of methane the way it was discussed in Glasgow. And by the way, I just want to paint a little picture of what's going on in these conferences. Have any of you been to a conference of the parties? So they're held in huge conference centers with at least one plenary hall that can seat 4,000 or 5,000 people. Because when all the government delegates get together, there will be several thousand, plus observers, plus media. You need at least seats for 4,000 or 5,000. So a very big hall. But then what's critical is you have many, many breakout rooms around that, where the delegates do most of the negotiation, not in a plenary session, but in subsections by issue. So you have a forest conversation in one place, and a methane conversation somewhere else, and a finance conversation. And then around that conference center are pavilions where anyone who's got an official badge, which I have as an observer from Yale, can walk around. And the pavilions are by countries, by groups, like the World Wildlife Fund had a place, some think tanks, and it's like an ongoing 2-week-long ideas fest. And people are presenting ideas, and there's little conversations going on, sometimes 30 people, sometimes 20, sometimes 100, hearing about some of the cutting-edge issues. So over the course of 2 weeks, more than 1,000 panel discussions about various pathways forward. And that was itself fascinating, because suddenly the world is getting serious about big picture what we have to do. I presented on some research I've done with almost 100 researchers, policy experts across the United States, called America's Zero Carbon Action Plan. And this is an attempt to lay out strategies for getting the United States to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, looking at 6 critical sectors: power generation, transportation, buildings, industry, food and agriculture, and materials, particularly plastics. So we have 6 different core elements we're looking at. We modeled what it would take, what the costs would be, what the opportunities are. And that same kind of discussion is now being done in many countries. So I was presenting alongside a Brazilian, talking about what can be done in Brazil. By the way, probably post-President Bolsonaro. But similarly, conversations about what's being done in Europe, what's being done in China. And in all cases, people are really digging in now to what a transformed future needs to look like. So it's quite interesting to see the seriousness of the conversation now emerging. And it was a great thrill for me to see people digging in, pushing back, thinking about this together. And yes, by the way, there are costs. There will be transition costs. And that brings me to another critical point about Glasgow. That for the first time in my recollection of going to these meetings, the concern about a just transition was front and center. So for all of you who come from traditions that care about justice and fairness, it was a front and center issue, and a lot of consideration given to those who will be dislocated by a change to a fossil-free future. And by the way, it's a whole series of people, domestically and internationally, starting with those who are facing tight budgets already, and may have to pay more as there's charges put on the use of fossil fuels. Certainly those in the fossil fuel producing communities. We might call that the West Virginia problem. But even more, and this is important for us to realize, people in rural areas have higher carbon footprints. They drive longer distance, often have more heating, air conditioning to do. So there's a lot of transition adjustments required to get people out from under the belief that the change that's being proposed is going to be bad for them. And that's where a lot of the political opposition comes from, is people are worried that the lives they know will not be allowed to go forward in one way or another. So the conversations about a just transition were, I thought, very important and significant. So we have a question. Do you want to come to the microphone and...
I just have a question about the topic of power generation. So, where do you think nuclear energy fits into the future of green energy? Since like countries like France are some of the cleanest, but they use some of the most nuclear energy in the country.
That's a really good question, and I think a lot of environmental folks have had their thinking change, because if you look out at the scope of options, there are very few large supplies of power, or sometimes called base load power, that are zero emissions, and nuclear is one. By the way, you probably all know this, but Connecticut is the France of America. We're getting about half our power from nuclear power stations, and that gives us a quite low carbon footprint compared to others. Now, I worried when I was commissioner of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection about where the waste at the end of the spent fuel cycle would go. It should be sent to Nevada, where there is, in fact, a very well-established deep cavern into which it could be put. Frankly, politics has obstructed that. So instead, we have it spread out in 200 places across the country, sitting in tanks, a very bad solution to the problem. But I think it is hard to imagine a success in getting to a deep decarbonization over 20 to 30 years without some nuclear power. And I think the real answer to what the clean energy future looks like is that we don't know today where the breakthroughs will come. We know we have the cost of solar power coming down, wind power coming down, but I'm a believer that we might not even know the power sources of the future. We need to continue to innovate. So I think some people think that there may be biofuels that could be successful, wave power, tidal power, geothermal power. I say put them all into a race, and let's let the world go and see which of these potential future energy sources can bring down their costs. And by the way, every one of those potential energy sources of the future has a problem or two to overcome. Wind and solar is still more expensive than fossil fuel burning, and it's intermittent. What do you do when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine? The answer, of course, is you need better storage and batteries, but the cost of those is not low enough. So that's the problem for wind and solar. A number of the other options from the renewable side are too expensive. They have to innovate to bring down costs. By the way, I put nuclear right in there, but there's a problem. Recent plants have been too expensive to build, there's a waste issue, and there's a terrorism issue. So that's a lot of challenges before you say, full bore ahead for nuclear. And I, in my list, would put the fossil fuels in the starting gate of this race. It's got a pretty high hurdle because it's got to figure out how to capture the carbon and have it stored. But carbon capture is another topic that is very hot in Glasgow. And we have to figure out what to do with the air pollution. So you can't burn fossil fuels right now without causing both air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. So, fossil fuels I would put a lot of money on, because that's a big challenge. Especially I would put money on coal. But, all of these could be a breakthrough. And I give them all a chance. So in fact, other side agreements that were going on included an agreement on forests. So 120 countries in Glasgow agreed to halt deforestation by 2030, including some of the problem countries, like Brazil. So that was good news. There was also something called the Breakthrough Agenda that was agreed upon, which was a 10-year innovation effort designed to really try to spark breakthroughs in the hard-to-decarbonize sectors. So cement, steel, aviation, food and agriculture. So that's an exciting thing as well, to see people really committing to trying to drive breakthroughs in some of those tough sectors. Now, just a few other things that I want to set the stage with, and then we can jump into more questions and give and take. I do think that this focus on a just transition helps to make the conversation broader and more voices heard. So one of the things that was remarkable in Glasgow is how many different perspectives were on display, including voices I think had been left behind in the past. Indigenous people, minority communities, people who are in politically disempowered communities. So there was a lot of emphasis on that. And I think it did make a difference. I think another thing that happened in Glasgow was there was a lot of media attention. This was front page news all over the world for the better part of 2 weeks. And that's a huge amount of environmental education going on. And I do think around the world, and I can tell you, certainly in Glasgow, you could go into the local pub and everybody knew about the COP that was in town. Everybody knew that the UK was hosting, Scotland in particular was hosting the world trying to take up this issue. And from my vantage point, I think there was a similar amount of environmental education, not quite as much as the host country, but a lot going on all over the world. And so I do think there's change in that regard. The other thing I mentioned briefly, let me just come back to, is that the corporate world was stepping up in a big way. So hundreds of companies, thousands by the end of last week, had announced their own net zero greenhouse gas emissions plans. And so that's a big deal. Now, of course, there's many thousands of companies that have not made a pledge in this regard, but a huge number of big companies, more than half of the Fortune 500, have now made pledges. And this pairs up with another observation that I had from Glasgow, which is the world is now unwilling to take commitments of this kind on face value. So there was a lot of push to have people explain what's underneath their pledge. How are they going to do it? What's the business model transformation? What is the pathway to 2050? What are the interim targets? What metrics will be reported on? How often? And so a lot of people were put on the hot seat after they made a pledge. I think it's going to be hard to completely walk away from these pledges. In addition, and this is another part of the story, there is, I think, a growing sense of the world wanting transparency and calling out people that are seen as disingenuous, who might be greenwashing, not telling the truth. And I saw a significant number of people called out for what were seemingly traditional things they would have said without question in the past. The Prime Minister of Norway was called out for saying that Norway was headed for a clean energy future when they're still pumping oil out of the North Sea. And by the way, one of the pavilions in this conference center had a banner up where they declared each day the fossil of the day, which is somebody who was saying something they thought was crosswise with the future clean energy. The Prime Minister of Norway, I think, was quite embarrassed to have a whole day where his name was there as the fossil of the day. Corporate leaders were called out, people who were not on the program. And that brings me really to the final part of where I wanted to see the energy was coming from. So you have a conference of government delegates, you have pavilions around it with countries kind of telling their stories, environmental groups, think tanks, universities, all telling their stories in this Ideas Fest. And then you have, beyond that, kind of side events to the side events with a business World Climate Summit, hundreds of companies coming to tell their story, how they're engaged. And then you have street theater, which is Extinction Rebellion, this British organized group, blocking roads, putting up banners. You had Greta Thunberg, the famous Swedish activist, marching with her banner. Did you all see it? No more blah, blah, blah. And that became a quite potent argument in the main conversations. People would say, oh, that's not good. It's just more blah, blah, blah. So I think the young people on the streets really had a remarkably powerful influence on the conversation in what might have once been considered the inner sanctum, which, by the way, is broadening now with all these side events and the outer events. And I think the bottom line story of this whole Glasgow event is that the seeming main event, the government-to-government conversations, were moving slowly, not breaking particular new ground, and effectively receded a bit in terms of importance. And what might have once been seen as the side shows became the main show. So these corporate commitments, and especially the world of finance coming in, Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, rallied 400 and I think now 50 banks and other financial institutions to say that they were lending going forward would be in alignment with a move to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Now there was some pushback. He was not quite fossil of the day, but he did get a call out for people saying, are you really serious about this? And how are you going to do it? Because there's trillions of dollars in financing in those big banks and insurance companies and other financial institutions. But their commitments were pretty serious. And I think, again, people are going to have a hard time backing away, having stood up publicly, and having a bunch of groups now, including Mark Carney, this former high-level guy, saying he's going to watch and call out people who are themselves not standing up to be real about it. So all of this, I think, is actually driving an amazing amount of change. And another sign of change, all the heads of international organizations, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the UN Development Program, the World Health Organization, the UN Food and Agriculture Program, were all in Glasgow. Now, I have seen them come to prior events of this kind. They come for an hour, give a speech, and fly away. These folks stay for 3, 4, 5 days because they understand that the work of the World Bank or the World Trade Organization has to now be aligned with this global commitment on climate change. So even while the governments were struggling in the inner sanctum to get a deal done, all these other institutions and forces were coming together to insist that change was now happening. And I do think there was one more piece that I want to put in front of you, and that is a lot of other issues that are one step to the side of climate change but related were also under discussion. Biodiversity and species extinction, the need for better conservation strategies, the importance of protecting the ocean in what's now being called the blue economy, dozens and dozens of panels about these issues. The importance of, as I said before, food and agriculture. Dozens of conversations, probably 100 panels over the course of 2 weeks on what it would take to get a decarbonized farming world to really move forward. And a lot of discussion about adaptation. For those who don't follow this lingo, taking down your greenhouse gas emissions is called mitigation, recognizing some amount of climate change has probably already occurred, and that means we're going to have some degree of adaptation or investments in resilience. So Connecticut, for example, is already doing that. We're raising roads that might otherwise flood. We're moving power substations out of harm's way. We're thinking about how to ensure that sewage treatment plants don't get overtaken by hurricanes. So there's a lot of investment in that agenda. And I do think that, too, is an important sign that people are really on top of the change that's going to be required. So, last few points. I think the real story here was the story from the side events to the outer ring of conversations to the street events. And this was really driving, I think, the energy of the gathering in Glasgow. I do think that there is now a real push to get serious about decarbonization. And I think there was a lot of presence of important, influential entities, businesses in particular, banks in particular, but a whole lot of others that really were showing up with a seriousness of purpose. And my final sign that things are really moving is that I have now got several signals that smart money is moving towards a bet that the transformation towards a clean energy future is now happening and it's unstoppable. So let me give you just a few examples. Number one, a couple of months ago, 3 management-nominated directors for ExxonMobil Corporation were defeated by an insurgent set of 3 directors put forward by a hedge fund called Engine Number 1. And Engine Number 1 believes the world needs to decarbonize, so they put up 3 alternatives to the Exxon management's candidates for director, and the insurgents won. So now at every ExxonMobil board meeting, 3 folks are there saying, really, more oil? Oh no, I don't think so. What's the alternative? How do we transition to being an energy company, not an oil company? And by the way, let's be clear, 51% of the shareholders of the world's most, I guess I'm not allowed to say that word in church, but hard-nosed oil company voted to change directors and give up on the management strategy. These people were not investors in Patagonia. They knew they owned shares in ExxonMobil. But 51% said, we don't think the management strategy is working, the world needs to change. Dramatic. The other thing, which I hope some people in this room benefited from this last week, was the rise of an electric truck company called Rivian. Now, what's the interesting thing about Rivian? They went forward last week with what's known as an initial public offering. They floated stock. Now, that is not unusual. What was unusual was how high a value this stock sale put on Rivian. Does anyone know what that IPO, as it's called, produces a value, a market capitalization of this just launched truck company? By the way, how many trucks has Rivian sold? Does anyone know?
0.
Actually, it's not true. They've sold 256. But effectively 0. So this is a company with no track record. The stock price on day 1 went to a valuation of the company at $70 billion. On day 2, it went to 90. On day 3, it's over $100 billion valuation, which is greater than the market value of Ford or General Motors. So what does that tell you? Smart money thinks that Rivian survives this transition to a clean energy future, perhaps survives, and Ford and General Motors does not. Those companies do not. So this is a significant signal that important forces in our society that control the flow of capital, which is fundamental to whether we'll have the money necessary to transition to a clean energy future, are betting the future is going to be changed. It is going to be decarbonization. It is going to be clean energy. So I think one could say, without certainty, but with some signal of promise, that the world is evolving. And my final example, the Business Roundtable, an organization of a couple of hundred CEOs of America's biggest companies, has announced recently that it no longer believes the purpose of a company, of a corporation, should be to maximize shareholder profits. Now that has been a core teaching of business schools for more than 50 years, going back to something called the Friedman Doctrine, named after Milton Friedman, famous University of Chicago professor, who said companies should leave it to governments to worry about what environmental policy is or any of the rest of it, just maximize profits and obey the law. So as long as you obey the law, whatever you do to maximize profits is okay. This collection of CEOs has now announced that they believe that world of shareholder primacy, as it was called, must give way to stakeholder responsibility, and that it's no longer acceptable for companies to profit at the expense of their suppliers, their customers, their employees, their communities, or society as a whole. Now, is that taught or is it real? We'll have to see. But it's a pretty fundamental shift. And I think it reflects, and this is why I'm ultimately quite positive, I think it reflects a societal change, an ethical change, that it is no longer acceptable to large swath of the public for companies to benefit privately at a cost to society. And whether that cost comes in smoke out of a smokestack, or effluent out of a pipeline, or greenhouse gases released into the atmosphere, it's no longer okay to spill your environmental harms on all of us and privately take the profits on them. And I think that's a pretty profound change. And I think it's not in law yet, although it is moving towards law in the European Union. But I think it's coming. And in economics terms, and this is how I've written about it, it's what we would call an end to uninternalized externalities. So an externality is going to harm you spill out onto society. And I think the new rule is going to be stop that harm. If you can't stop it, you're going to have to pay fully for the amount that gets spilled. By the way, in my theory, you should pay the victims, not the government. If there's breathers breathing your pollution, they should get benefit. Or drinkers drinking the water in pollution, they should get compensated. But I think we're moving towards a new baseline for business that says, in effect, you cannot privatize gains at public cost, a fundamental principle. And I think for most people that feels ethically correct. And for the last 200 years, in Connecticut, where this industrial revolution of America began, there was an assumption that we had to accept a certain amount of byproduct of economic activity, a certain amount of harm from industry in order to get the benefits of all the things companies could produce. I think people are saying now, if you can't stop your harm or compensate those who are hurt from it, maybe you're not serving society's purpose. And there is something in the academic world called a social license to operate. It's not a real license, but it's the idea that all of us, the public, accepts a company as a good corporate citizen or not, depending on how they behave. And I think there's starting to be some change in what that baseline of expectations is. So let me stop there and say thank you. I'm eager to have thoughts, comments, questions, pushback. We're going to see if we can get people a microphone. We'll try to run this one to you so that those who are listening online can hear.
Dan, I thank you. You've covered most of what you could cover here, but I noticed just a few omissions.
Sure.
One, you did not mention ocean transport and the problems of pollution for ocean transport. And the other, so I'll sit down and let you answer, is I think you've underestimated the ability of geothermal heating in the factor of home heating. Geothermal power is used in certain parts of the world as a major source of heating homes, mostly in places that are short on oil, but in various other places. United Illuminating down in New Haven back in 1938, I think it was, put in a geothermal unit. I think there's a huge future in that. You don't have to worry about transporting energy, and you're not having to have hot enough temperatures to make electricity out of it. You're using it as a substitute for home heating oil.
So 2 good points, and I'd already run 45 minutes, so I had to leave out a few points. But here's a good one. First of all, with regard to geothermal, I think you're right. And so it's on my list of a product, a strategy that in some places will be the winner. And by the way, who's going to win on geothermal? Iceland, the Philippines. If you have volcanic material nearby, you don't have to dig too deep to get to boiling water. You've got a geothermal potential. And by the way, I think everyone's going to have different answers. Some people are very excited about wind. Guess what the potential is in Connecticut? Very low. We're one of the least windy states in the country. Now, not too far away, we've got some ocean potential. But Connecticut has, as you all know, a giant barrier island we call Long Island, shielding us from big wind. So we are a not promising place for wind power. We're not that promising for geothermal either, although I work in a building that has a geothermal backstop. But there will be some places that geothermal will be the winner. I think, no doubt. So, I'm a big believer in geothermal. In fact, the ocean shipping and the aviation industries, 2 of the harder to decarbonize sectors, both were very much present in Glasgow, and both were part of something called the First Movers Coalition, which basically said, we in these sectors know we have a tough situation, and we'd like to get out in front of it, and we're committing to buy solutions that people can come to us with innovative breakthrough ideas. So a number of airlines, including Delta and United, and air freight companies, including Boeing and Airbus, committed to taking on whatever ideas could come and front-load investment in them. So Airbus is going to buy a lot of hydrogen on the theory that maybe planes in the future fly on hydrogen. Boeing is, I think, looking at electrification of some planes, and Delta and United have both committed to buy what's known as sustainable aviation fuel, which is probably going to be a biofuel. So what's interesting about these commitments is that these airlines are willing to put up the money up front to help the investment to make that alternative product come alive, make it work, and to put up enough scale of dollars that the folks that are doing the investment know that they'll get paid back if they can make it work. So I think there's a lot of creative efforts to make the economics of this transformation real. And that's what I felt was so different about this conversation in Glasgow, that there was some big money coming in behind the momentum for change, sector by sector, globally, locally, nationally. And that starts to, from my point of view, make a degree of momentum that delivers change regardless of what's going on in the political conversation over there. And I think that's what, is quite important. Other questions, comments? And I hate to say this, but you may be on a mic run.
Something you didn't address was government subsidies to the oil and gas industry. And along the same line, the carbon tax. Now I realize it didn't go well in France and Australia, so it's a political issue, but it seems to me that's one of the keys to solving the climate crisis.
So we'll do the carbon pricing first, which I think the word tax still gets so many people riled up. It's better to think of it not as a tax, but as a charge or a pricing mechanism. I like to think of it as a harm charge. You've heard my principle, we should make people pay for the harm they cause. By the way, that's not revolutionary. To the alternative, it is very traditional. Our principle that you should, if you cause harm, compensate people for it. Well, first, stop it. Second, compensate. Is a 500-year-old tradition that goes back in American law before America to Britain. And there's a very well-established principle, basically in property law as well as tort law, that says if you cause someone harm to their land or to themselves, you must stop or pay. And I think that principle is now being brought forward in a new modern form. And I do think carbon charges would be a good thing. And they're being put in all over the world. Some 50-plus jurisdictions now have a carbon charge in one form or another. By the way, there's two core ways to do it. One is to literally make people pay per ton of emissions, and the other is to have what's known as a cap and trade program, where you limit the amount of emissions and then say everyone who's emitting has to get an allowance for each ton of emissions, and you let the price move with the market. That's what was proposed in the Obama administration. Did not go well. Now it's the so-called Waxman Martin legislation. Having said that, we have in the Northeast a cap on greenhouse gas emissions from our utility sector, and that's working pretty well. That's called RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Emission, RGGI. And so we have a price in Connecticut on emissions, and it has helped us, by the way, to have an incentive for those that are causing these harms to reduce the harm to the greatest extent possible, and it's generated substantial resources for investments in clean energy. So I think that pricing does matter, and that it should be part of any package. And I'm sorry the Biden administration has, I think, learned the wrong lessons, but the lessons you suggest, which is that pricing scares people and makes it difficult. Now, I've forgotten your first question.
The carbon tax and also the subsidies.
Oh, yes. Subsidies are completely correct. We have a whole set of existing fossil fuel subsidies, and frankly, subsidies beyond that for unsustainable behavior. Cutting trees in national forests, building roads through forests. And my view is all of that should be paid for too. So if you extract natural resources with some kind of a subsidy, that should stop. And we should undo all the harmful subsidies that are in place, undo the tradition of making it easy for people to extract public resources, And if people, we still want people to cut trees, but they should pay fully for it. And all of this is part of this idea that we no longer have to give things away to business to make it worth their while to provide for us. That might have been true 200 years ago. It's certainly not true today. Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Dan. I came in here not feeling hopeful, and I'm feeling hopeful, so I really appreciate it. Do you have any ideas on what people can do individually for their town, for their states?
So I think all of us can begin to transition our own lives to a decarbonized future. Some people are better positioned than others to make big investments in that transition. Not everyone can afford a Tesla, but if you can afford, I, by the way, have a very much cheaper electric car, a Chevy Bolt. But I think moving to help support the idea that one of the key strategies for deep decarbonization is electrification of almost everything. So the transport sector needs to be largely electric, cars and trucks. That's why Rivian has gotten such a valuation, as people believe that very soon, maybe in 10, but certainly in 20 years, every vehicle on the road is going to be electric. So I think everyone who's thinking about buying a new car should be thinking electric. Everyone who is building a house in the future will probably have an all-electric home. So for a long time we thought that having a gas furnace was better than an oil burner, but oil was better than electric. Electric heat was expensive. Almost certainly in the future it'll be heat pumps, which by the way is a variation on the geothermal story. So we're going to have heat pumps, and probably, if you're building a new home in the next 5 years, you should be looking at that as an option. Or if you're replacing an old furnace, I don't know whether it's fully functional in cold New England, but I think you're going to end up with a heat pump backed up by a furnace that is used only on your coldest days. And all of us can also invest in energy efficiency. If you haven't done a home energy audit, these things pay for themselves on the day they're done with new light bulbs and identification of ways you can save money. So I think everybody has that opportunity. And I think the other thing is to help to normalize the idea of being part of the clean energy future. What we found in Connecticut, which was fascinating, of what it would take to convince someone to put a solar array on the roof. And I thought it would be good financing. It would be subsidies. And it turned out the most important thing was to see the neighbors do it. If you see your neighbors doing it, you think, well, I can do that. It must not be that hard. The Smiths are doing it. How is it they can do it? Maybe I should try it. And so the neighbor effect turns out to be very powerful. So I think helping to model the behavior that is going to be required to transform the society. And again, not everyone can do all of this. In fact, one of the things that's interesting now is we realize that a lot of homes are not so good for solar power. Too many trees, not the right southern direction for the roof. So, but those who can should. And there is a lot of support now to help finance these changes. And I think that, for a long time we didn't realize that people often can't change because they don't have money burning a hole in their pocket at the moment when a transition opportunity arises. I can tell you that myself. When your furnace comes out and it's 20 degrees out, you don't call up and the first thing you ask is, how's your high efficiency furnaces? You ask, what furnace do you have available you can bring over today to replace my broken furnace? So we've got to do more to get people to make transitions under non-stressed moments where the idea of shifting towards a clean energy future is not jarring for the other things that matter in their lives, like keeping the family warm. Please.
I also wanted to thank you for speaking, and one thing, I think you mentioned load shifting. So you did mention that the problem with wind and solar was that sometimes the sun's not shining and it's not blowing, but those tend to happen during the day, and that right now is when the load for electricity is the highest, so it's actually helping that. And I mean, the electric company does have a program that encourages people to use things after 8 o'clock. You can sign up for this to get a discount. And
so So it's a great point. Sometimes we call it, by the way, peak load shaving, because it's a very interesting situation with our electric system, our electric grid, where our demand rises and falls by time of day and by season. And we have to build the system to the maximum load, the maximum amount of electricity that people might ever be drawing off the system. Because should you fail to have enough electricity that day, you can cause the whole system to go into failure. That's when you get the big blackouts. But it means that we're running most of the time at only 60% of capacity, because the load is going up and down, and you've got this peak load waiting, or peak generating capacity waiting for the hottest summer day or the coldest winter night. And it's a very bad business to be in something where you're only at 60% capacity. If you try to run a hotel and you only fill the room 60% of the time, you'd be bankrupt. If you ran an airline and only filled 60% of the seats, you'd be bankrupt. So we have this problem of a grid that requires this capacity that's high and average amount of use that's much, much lower. So you're quite right that load shifting is critical so that you never bump up against the peak. And we've got a couple of strategies for doing that in our society. One is called a demand response, which says that on those peak days, we actually will pay some people to stop drawing power. And it's mostly big companies. We say, slow the factory down, shut down your demand. And you're actually paid to do that. But in the future, we should be setting up so that everyone's electric cars could discharge at those peak moments. By the way, these are moments usually in hours, but not days. So, but if we all had electric cars that could put electricity on the grid on the hottest August afternoons, we could actually do a lot to reduce the cost of our system by shading that peak load. And there's a variety of other strategies. One could also create a smart appliance, a refrigerator that shuts off for a second or two every minute. The refrigeration won't be diminished, but you could produce some electricity. And in the future, we might actually get a smart grid connected to smart appliances so that we're monitoring and we're realizing we're bumping up against that capacity. And without even asking anyone to do anything in their home, we could change the settings. And the smart appliances would start diminishing how much electricity they draw. And by the way, it's a heck of a lot better to have 2 seconds per minute of lost electricity than have a blackout for 6 hours. So there's a bunch of things where technology can help us move our system toward a cleaner future that's also a more economically efficient and cheaper future. And that really is the key. If you can align economic logic, individual family circumstance, budget benefit, and sustainability, then you have a big win. Please, you want to come to this mic here?
First, thank you so much. And myself and a colleague and some students are here from Cheshire Academy because we wanted to see you in person and not just on Zoom like we had to on Earth Day a year and a half ago.
I remember that. That was like the first big tragic event of not being live. It was my first big Zoom talk. You guys were nice to set it up, but welcome. It's nice to have you here live in person.
Thank you. So my question goes very much off of what you just said, right? This connection between the economic and the environmental. So we see these, corporations, Fortune 500 companies, coming and understanding that this is the wave of the future. And you use the term smart money, right? We've seen financial firms divest or build into this ESG model. What is it going to take, in your perspective, for that to trickle down, right, to the municipal level? For us in a town like Cheshire, for Wallingford, Meriden, for us to understand that our choices are not just good for the wallet, but also for the environment, right? When we look to rebuild municipal buildings, why are we not looking at heat pumps? Why are we not looking at solar ready from day one when it has such good ROI that we know of?
So this is a really good point. And so I'll say 2 things. First, and this is to answer a little bit to Diane's question about what we can all do. A lot of people are now saying, and you use the acronym, and I'll spell out, but that they want to better align their investments with their values. And so a lot of you have an opportunity, if you've got a portfolio, to say to your money manager, I want to know about ESG performance of these companies, the environmental, social, and governance performance. And you can say, I don't want to be in companies that are leading us away from a sustainable future. I want to be in companies that are aligned with a sustainable future. And almost every investment manager now realizes they have to have some investment vehicles with that alignment, because this is now mainstream investor saying this. And by the way, there's long been a group called the socially responsible investor, by the way, churches, who would say, we can't have our endowment be gun makers, we're churches. This is wrong. Other people, labor unions would say, we're not going to invest in companies with bad union records. We have to have our pension fund in clean, good labor companies. So this now has expanded way beyond that. And mainstream investors, by the millions, are saying, I want that alignment between my values and my portfolio. And so this is something, if you have a pension, if you have any investable resources, you can say to the money manager, give me a sustainable fund. And by the way, this is my most recent book. It's on this topic. It's called Values at Work, subtitled Sustainable Investing and ESG Reporting. So it's all about this topic. And by the way, the values at work is, of course, not just environment, not just climate change. It's a whole set of values. It's about diversity. It's about inequality. It's about the gender makeup of management or the board of directors of the company. And there's a whole different set of metrics in these three categories: environment, social, governance. And some people prioritize one versus another, but it should all be out there. And if your investment advisor is giving you some of this, you can demand it. And by the way, if they can't produce it, you should find a different company that will be able to give you some of that. Now, to be truthful, the book I wrote says that the data are a mess, and we don't have really good metrics that allow us to identify leaders versus laggards, so it's not simple. But it's a trend, and it is coming. And I do think that is, again, one of the forces that's driving change, even ahead of governments regulating this change. And the other factor I see is companies wanting to appeal to the young people, to the folks you brought here, because these are the consumers of tomorrow, they're the workers of tomorrow. And basically, one of the other transformative changes in business education is that the old mechanisms for establishing competitive advantage, access to low-cost labor, access to raw materials, are giving way to a critical resource that's the dominant way to get a successful company in the 21st century, and that's to have the best workers. So knowledge workers are the defining success factor for companies. And by the way, your students, knowledge workers of tomorrow, all want to work for companies that have purpose. And I think that is why the corporate world is moving ahead of government, without even being told to do it, without regulation. Because they're competing both for the customers of tomorrow and for the workers of tomorrow, and they can't do it if people think they're a bad company. And I think this is what's really got those corporate leaders in Glasgow. Why did thousands of CEOs fly to Glasgow to be part of those climate companies? Now, they didn't think they had to do that 10 years ago, but they do now, because they want to show the alignment with these big trends. And by the way, the young people under 30, never mind under 20, all care about these issues. They care about the environment broadly, they care about climate change across party lines, they care about equality, racial justice. These are not as divisive issues among younger people as they are seemingly among older people. So again, there's reason to be optimistic, because every day the younger crowd that is trying to force action is rising. And I do think it's one of the engines of transformative change. We've got three different ones. We'll go 1, 2, and then 3.
Thank you for coming tonight, sharing your expertise and your experiences with us. My question is, what can you tell us about feeding seaweed to cattle and cows, and to reduce the
It's a great
methane emissions?
It's a great question, and the answer is there's a lot of work being done now on how to get a transformed dairy industry. And you're quite right. One of the most promising things is there's some kinds of seaweed that appear to be feed that you could feed to the animals, and it reduces the enteric methane, the methane from their digestive systems. And this is a potential big breakthrough. And that's why I think you've got, and by the way, the dairy industry, and I do some work for the U.S. dairy industry, is on this now. They realize they've got to change. And there's going to have to be a different sort of cow of the future, or at least a feed of the future for the cow of the future. Now, I don't know if that's enough of an answer, but it's a start of an answer. And I think we've got a lot of folks in the dairy world that are ready to sign on to this 30% reduction in methane by 2030. And by the way, you can't get that done unless you've got some amount of the technology ready to go. It's just a question of pushing it out across all the farmers. So I think that's coming. But it's still probably not enough. And that's the real story here, is that there's a lot of promising things being done. We can get the first bit of the way. My own zero carbon action plan says we have a line of sight on about 80% of the emissions reductions required to get to net zero by 2050, but not 100%. And so there's still innovation. By the way, I did not explain, net zero does not mean zero emissions. Is everyone clear on this? It means you're going to reduce emissions a lot, and then there's probably a residual that is going to have to be offset. And that's why a big conversation, very big in Glasgow, was on carbon capture. So how do we pull that last bit of carbon out? And there's two big answers, both of which are being pursued with a lot of vigor and effort. One is called nature-based solutions, and that's the idea that we should do what we've always done to capture carbon, and that is have green plants suck it up in the process of photosynthesis. So what we can do in the nature-based solutions is to plant more trees. So when people say it's going to be tree planting, that is of course not sufficient, but it is important. And so planting a lot more trees is a big deal. By the way, we can also improve our nature-based solutions by land use management, by better strategies of farming and tending of land in all places. So nature-based solutions is clearly part of it. And the other thing then is what is called engineered carbon removal. And that is literally sucking the carbon out of the air. It's done already sometimes in carbon dioxide going up a smokestack in a power plant or anywhere you're burning fossil fuels. But there is now work being done to just take it out of the air. And it might be that you put use machines in various places. And the first commercial scale carbon removal facility opened in Iceland just a couple of months ago. Now, it turns out it takes a great deal of energy to run these things. So, in fact, in most places, it would be not a net positive. But, as someone pointed out earlier, shouting out Iceland, Iceland has a lot of geothermal power, and therefore it has a lot of low greenhouse gas emissions energy. And there are some other places in the world where it may be enough of its clean energy that you can do carbon removal. In fact, there's a number of African countries that are thinking they might, with either hydropower or solar power, also be part of the carbon removal business that may emerge. We may all be paying people who have that access to low cost, low carbon electricity to do this carbon removal for us. All right, very good question. We're going here and then back over there.
Good evening, thank you for the talk. As citizens and laymen, why don't governments get a greater sense of urgency regarding cleaner energy? We as citizens have gotten the message, or we're getting the message, but I don't see it happening around the world. Can you explain that, please?
You know, I think this is actually one of the tragedies of our divided political America. Because I do think the public is broadly behind clean energy. When I was heading the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, I can tell you I could get 80% of any room, no matter what the party makeup, to say they wanted more clean energy. But then there was a challenge where you start talking about climate change, and then the partisan knives come out and people don't agree. But I do think framed as a future of clean energy, there is a very broad base of support. And by the way, it's interesting how that spans all across the spectrum. And also the idea that some amount of this could be decentralized and distributed generation is called. And I do think that is also attractive across the political spectrum. People who don't want to be reliant on big utilities. So I think there is a lot of potential for change, but the politics have been difficult. And I think it's, I think both parties have used this as what sometimes is called a wedge issue. And that just makes it very hard to bring people together. But you heard me say, and I'll repeat now, I do not think we will be successful in delivering the transformative change, completely redoing the energy foundation of our society, unless we figure out how to do that on a bipartisan basis. Just too tough to make the kind of changes happen and the investments required. So that's a download, just for what was otherwise an optimistic perspective on the possibilities here. I'm not that optimistic about getting people to work together across the party lines, at least in the short term. Did I see, was there another question here, please? Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much.
We want to get to a microphone, so those who are on online can hear you.
Thank you very much for being here tonight and all of the wonderful information you shared. I wondered if you could comment on the Transportation Climate Initiative and if you had any suggestions for how we can get the naysayers into the fold to try to make this happen.
So the Transportation Climate Initiative is an effort that a number of states have undertaken. It was actually worked out originally by a team at Georgetown University, a very carefully constructed idea for trying to do an effect for transportation, what's been done already for the utility sector. And that is getting people to pay for the harm they're causing. The challenge is it's very hard to get people to pay when no one else is paying. And so I think there was a sense that, why should Connecticut burden its drivers with additional costs when if you're driving in California or in Texas, you wouldn't have to pay this. And that is a challenge. And I think Connecticut citizens feel burdened already with high costs of energy and high taxes. So I think the real answer here is that as soon as we are moving towards this principle that everybody should pay for the harm they're causing, it'll be much easier to get Connecticut to do it. But it's if we're stepping up ahead of everybody else and we're going to bear costs that no one else is, that the politics becomes tough. But I think this is the direction we're moving. And I do think the other piece of this that's important is what happens to the money that gets collected when people pay for the harm they're causing, in this case from driving. And if we were to recycle that by lowering other taxes, that is to say the money comes in because you're paying for the driving, but now your income tax is going to come down, I think that might address some of the politics. But I think it was not as carefully structured in terms of the political story around that Transportation Climate Initiative. And as a result, it faltered. And by the way, it was not killed by Republicans alone. Some leading Democrats also were part of that political sort of falling apart. All right, got a couple of questions on this side. We'll take one here and then two here.
So going back to when you were talking about carbon capture, ExxonMobil recently invested in carbon capture machines for their plants in Saudi Arabia. So should we give them credit for removing carbon, or is it more of a testament to their lack of changing business model and maintaining oil over becoming an energy business?
So it's a really good question. You heard me say that I am willing to put the fossil fuel companies into the clean energy race for the future. Because if they could really figure out how to do carbon capture at scale and at low cost, it might be that the fossil fuel burning can be brought back. I'm not betting on it, and I don't think we can count on it. And at least at this point, the carbon removal, this engineered carbon removal, is at 10 times the cost it would need to be. So we're not close. There's a lot of other things that I think are more promising in terms of short-term economics or even medium-term economics. But I'm giving credit for Trump. And when asked, I was invited by the province of Alberta to go and advise them on what to do, and they've got this very dirty, oil sands that they can extract. And I said, first of all, you should put a carbon charge on so everyone thinks you're being serious about a clean energy future. But second, if I were you, I'd have the University of Alberta become the carbon removal technology innovation center of the world. Because this is not going to be a resource you can ever exploit unless you figure out a low-cost carbon removal strategy. And one of the things I learned, again, in my time in Connecticut as the commissioner, is you don't want to guess where the innovation is going to come from. Very hard to figure it out, even if you have studied it, as I have, for 30 plus years. So I don't pretend to tell you where the breakthroughs are going to come, who is going to be the winner out the far end of a clean energy future. I doubt it's going to be the fossil fuels, but if someone's willing to bet the other way, I'm happy to have them do it. And one of the other things we know about innovation is that it's very important to have a diversity of options pursued. And one of the things that societies benefit from is when there's people with different ideas willing to put their money in different directions. So if ExxonMobil wants to bet on that corner of the energy future, I say, good for them. Let them do it. And it's not a bet I'm willing to take. I don't own shares in ExxonMobil. I don't bet that they're going to be the winners out the other side of this. But if somebody wants to bet, it's okay.
I have a question about electric car batteries and the minerals and the rare earth things that are used to make them, and the sustainability of them. It seems like you always see on the news that the countries that are giving us those materials, there's a lot of not so great things going on to get those. There's a shortage of that, and also that China's kind of buying up a lot of the areas where that stuff is. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So again, I don't know how much of this you all know, but there are certain special materials that are critical, by the way, not to car batteries, but to electronic devices and other things. Things like molybdenum and lithium, which is a key to the batteries. And these are sometimes there's a cluster of about 10 of them called rare earths, rare earth materials. And you're quite right. China has a good bit of the existing known reserves of these and has played that to strategic advantage. But there's been a lot of work in the last decade to find other sources. So Australia has a fair bit now too. And there's other sources being identified all the time. So I think it is a strategic risk for the United States now to have so much of this dependent on China as a not very reliable supplier. So I think that if I were in a strategic position, I'd be urgently exploring for other sources of these materials. The other thing I think we have to get better at, and I think is coming as part of this broader move toward not just addressing the climate change problem, but a broader push toward what I call the sustainability imperative, is that we shouldn't be throwing away any of these old electronic devices. They should all be disassembled and the rare earths taken out and recaptured and reused. And frankly, that should be our model in the world. I think we should be headed for a principle that says we expect not only zero pollution, but zero waste. And you should pay for any waste that you cause. I've tried to do this, by the way, as commissioner, failed completely. But my view was that you should pay for your trash, and you should pay for anything that you consume that has a burden on society at the end of its life. And we did get, in a very small way, a principle that paint cans can be returned, and stores have to take back the paint cans. That was good. Mattress is the same thing. But I think electronic recycling should be done in a much more vigorous way. And we really should be headed for what I think is sometimes talked about as a closed-loop economy, or sometimes talked about as a circular economy. And this is part of what a sustainable future has to look like. And I think we have, for a couple of hundred years, thought that there was endless supplies of all these materials, endless supplies of land, endless supplies of energy. And I think we're coming, and this is again a big kind of focus in the academic world, into clarity and focus now that we live in what's known as the Anthropocene. which is where the human size on the planet is big enough to shape the planet. And for most of human history, for 50,000 years, the planet was big and humanity was small. And so the planet defined humanity. Now it's the other way around. Humanity, 7.8 billion people, is very big. And the planet and its resources are in many ways limited. So now in this Anthropocene, it's humans that define the capacity of nature. And that's, profoundly challenging in important ways. And I think we have to, as a result, get better at closing these loops and really moving towards a greater respect for the limits of our planet.
Thanks very much for sharing your perspective. It was very interesting hearing about the different factions and actors that work inside and outside. But you left one group out, and it's not so much the elephant in the room, but the very room that we're in. Can you relate, did you know religious leaders there, and what perspectives they were sharing? And also, could you describe what you envision their role would be?
So there were, in fact, in Glasgow, significant religious representation. So I would say, not hundreds, but many hundreds of religious leaders there from all over the world and many different religions. And I do think, so I teach a course called Sustainability at Yale, and I actually have people read basic kind of religious teachings from all the world's major religions. One of the incredible points of convergence is how many of them have stewardship as part of their core beliefs. Now, of course, Christianity is particularly challenged because we also have dominion. So you have a little bit of a dominion-stewardship tension you have to work out. But I have a colleague who's teaching at Yale now who's really the world's leading expert in Islam and the environment. And there's deep commitments to environmental protection in Islam. In Judaism as well. So there's really quite a common moral core to, I think, the idea that we should be sustainable. And I think that it is one of the other challenges to get to a sustainable future, to solve the climate change problem, is that people have to think longer term. If you think short term, you can really fail on this. And I think spirituality broadly, our religious leaders in particular, are probably essential to getting people to think beyond their own narrow self-interest to a broader community, to an intergenerational reality, and to obligations we have to others in the community we're in the society we're in the country we're in, but also to the world beyond, to our children, our grandchildren, our generations yet unborn. And I think some traditions, particularly, for example, American indigenous traditions, focus on that quite heavily. And I think we're going to need to have more done in all religions to bring the sort of spiritual dimension to play. I, by the way, am explaining the success in 2015 of the Paris gathering that produced the 2015 Paris Climate Change Agreement, point to Pope Francis's environmental statement, Laudato Si, that encyclical, I thought was inspiring even for a non-Catholic. It was an uplifting of the importance of thinking beyond ourselves, and in doing so, bringing the environment into sharper focus. So I do think that religious leaders are critical to success on a problem of this scale and magnitude. So I think we probably have time for one last question, and then we'll have to close this out. I've kept you all for a long time, and some people have to get back to their homework.
Okay, well, thanks. One more question. As folks are talking about retooling the energy economy and reworking the global economy to think about these issues, I'd be curious to hear more about the conversations around equality and equity. How do we create an economy to create more economic opportunity, especially for those who've been disadvantaged?
So I said that in Glasgow, this idea of a just transition was front and center, and I think it's true. I think people have come to realize that in a moment of transition, you want to make sure that those who might have historically been left out are not left out. I think the Biden administration has actually done a pretty good job in saying that as we transition to the United States, we want to make sure there's jobs for those that might in the past not have been thought of. And the energy world, by the way, has been particularly white and has produced a lot of upper middle class jobs that were not spread across all demographic groups. So I think there is a lot of interest in attentiveness to that as the transition is underway. And by the way, this will create millions of new jobs. I didn't finish the story about the zero carbon action plan that I've been part of. So it does cost about 0.5% of GDP as the fossil fuel world goes away, and there are real jobs and livelihoods and communities that will be affected. But a couple of million net new jobs. And there's a bit of an interesting calculus there. A lot of these fossil fuel jobs are high paid. And some of the newer jobs, solar installer, renewable energy jobs, are lower paid, but there's many more jobs. And if done right, those could be dispersed because they're community-based jobs in many cases across different groups across society more broadly and fairly. And I think there's some focus on that now. And I do think, unlike at any time in the past, the reality of this transition that's coming and the fact that there will be some people jarred by it and will need to be attended to and brought along is important. And I think it's important, by the way, not just for fairness, although it is. It's also important to the politics, because you can't keep people moving on a transition if some people feel like life as they do it is being destroyed. And by the way, I'll tell you, my own view is people who feel like their communities are being wrecked or their livelihoods are being taken away fight to the death. And they'll fight, the transition. And it'd be much better to invest in a just transition, to get everybody on board this train that I think is now rolling, but needs to pick up speed. So thank you again for coming out for a long time. As well for having thought of this.
Actually, it was Diane's idea. Diane is here to take the names of anybody who wants to be put on a list to be notified of any future events. So, Diane, if we'll stand up, and those who are church members will get it with the usual church e-blasts and such, but anybody from outside the church is going to be on the mailing list. Speak to Diane. And Dan, thank you so much.